Hi everyone, bienvenidos, welcome back. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros de nuevo. Mi nombre es Adela Ramos, mis pronombres son ella, she, hers, and I'm really excited about today's show. I'm very happy to be here with my co-host Luke.
Yeah, bienvenidos a todos. I'm excited to be here también. Hey, we have a very special guest, near and dear to mi corazón, es Ángel. We actually started at the same time at PLU. We were both hired to be back in the day resident directors. And so we bonded over that experience. And we're both from California. So that's really exciting. Ángel, did you want to introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. Muchas gracias. My name is Ángel Gonzalez, pronouns him, he, they, them. Mi nombre es Ángel Gonzalez, pronombres él, ella. Y I am a first-generation Queer Latinx doctoral student at San Diego State University. Soy un estudiante de doctorado primera generación Latinx y miembro de la comunidad LGBT en la Universidad de San Diego. Y comencé con Luke. I started with Luke working at PLU back in 2014 when we first moved to Washington. So that's kind of where our story started. And that's also when we first met Profesora Adela Ramos, who was an instrumental part in our transition and surviving a different space than what we were used to, I would say, coming from California. But again, I'm really excited to be here. I'm always really happy when roads cross again with people who have been really impactful in your life. So this is just beautiful to be able to share space.
Well, thank you so much, Ángel. It's wonderful to see you and really, really special to have you here for today's conversation, which is going to address from a number of perspectives the really important and urgent topic of undocumented students and what it means to live your life in that particular situation. So we really just want you to kind of help us or kind of share with our audience what your immediate thoughts are on this topic. How do you approach the question of the undocumented experience?
I want to first and foremost start off kind of with what I share with you all. My positionality in regards to this topic, right? I am not undocumented, but I have worked with and for undocumented students and families. I would say my whole vida, right? Because my family came here from Mexico. They immigrated here illegally and then eventually got residency. My parents, I've had uncles and aunts who recently got, their documentation, but however lived very much in fear of, having undocumented status and what that meant in regards to their livelihoods every day. With students and working directly in higher education, right, that became even more of a reality of how that life translates into a structure and a system of education, which I think it's very unique or interesting that, we have students who are wanting to really pursue their dreams and their careers and their aspirations, and then we're not allowing them because these man-made structures, right, prohibit them from access to mobility and resources and betterment for their future and for their family, right? So for my work, it specifically has been, how I said, working for the students, working with them, or having family members who had undocumented status, and even still to this day have undocumented status. I have family members who work and they pay taxes and do everything else that everybody else does, without any of the benefits, without any of the protections. And I think in today's landscape more than ever, it's really scary. It's really scary. I remember back in 2016 when the first election happened, I had students who were undocumented text me the morning after, right, the results happened, asking me, ¿Qué va a pasar? Like, Ángel, tell me. I'm like, and I didn't have the answers. Like, it felt so disheartening to not know for them, right? To be like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And to find ourselves 4 years later and still in that similar capacity of, I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know what the institution's gonna do for you or not do for you.
Yeah.
Right. And then I think positioning myself as an individual, like, pero here's how I can help you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, here's how I can help you. But you know, this undocumented conversation, I think, in recently has tracked mobility. I think because of discourse around like model minority or model like immigration, like ideology, right? Like the dreamers, right? Like this coin identity of the dreamers and what that means. But it perpetuates this idea then like if you're not here to pursue education, then you're not worthy of perhaps documentation status. So that has allowed the conversation to really exist, I feel like, in a national landscape. But then it also still renders like undocumented folk individuals who are not on that track, right? Which is also okay. Like if you're not here to get an education and graduate, that's also valid. If you're here to work and to support your family back wherever you're from, because you're making way more than you would be over there, that's also okay. So I'll stop. I rambled on, but
that's okay. Yeah, and not everybody wants to pursue documentation either. That's not always the end goal, and that is always seen or stereotyped as the end goal. When you come to America, you're seen as like a documentation or citizenship is the dream, the American dream, I guess. And that has pros and cons as well. But I think you touched on something really important is about the university structures. And since you were a student and you are a student from undergrad to doctoral, but also a working professional, like we have this feeling, this sense of responsibility to care for our students, care for our community. And when that happened, it's like it was hard because we weren't able to have that immediate sense of like, here's the support, here's where we can help you right now. It's like we had to sit in it real quick and then find ways to move forward. But my question, I guess, is like, since you've been part of many different universities, you know, public and private, from undergrad to graduate, what does it mean to be a sanctuary campus? I think that has been floating around a bit. Sanctuary cities, and we've, you know, have seen the terminology of sanctuary campus. And then maybe what does that support look like in university life?
Yeah, I think, right, that was definitely a start. And I think we saw this big push 2016 happen where people became sanctuary campuses, cities, states, right? Like it kind of up the ladder, but without any actual like steps of what that meant. It was just like a word. And words matter, right? Language, critical discourse is important because the way that we describe things and write about things and you know, showcase things and experiences shapes the reality. So it's definitely important to make a statement. But I think for me, I continue to ponder what beyond that statement or what has happened since that statement at our institutions, right? How I said, I've worked at a variety of different type of institutions, and kind of where I've landed to build my career is the community college system. And at the community college, you know, we do have a disproportionate number of students from various minoritized identities, which include undocumented status. And one of that big reason is because of the cost associated with attending a community college in comparison to their four-year counterparts, right? And the inability for some of undocumented students to get resources like financial aid, right, or scholarships. If you're a DACA, you can qualify for that. But again, not everybody has DACA status. Individual states also grant different funding depending on legislature. So for example, in California, we have AB 540, which, you know, if you graduated from a high school and you attended at least 2 years of a California high school, then you're eligible to apply for certain like funding or certain waivers for folks who have demonstrated that they at least attended 2 years of high school. And even me, I benefit from that legislature that wasn't even created for me, right? Like right now I live in Washington, but I go to school in California, but I filed AB 540 because I graduated in a high school in California, so I get to pay in-state tuition, right? So even as somebody with like my privilege, I'm benefiting from like the work that undocumented have put in the front lines for us, right? And institutions like are not really doing anything, and we're seeing that. If we think about, you know, about Tuesday, right, 3 days ago, would that be Wednesday? What happened right now with DACA, right? Like, you know, we just saw what ICE released in regards to the status of DACA. Even though the Supreme Court last month ruled that DACA stays, it's still being under attack, right? It's still being under attack that now, they're not going to be accepting new or processing, filing new applications. And those that are in the process are not going to be for 2 years. It's going to be for now 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, these constant attack impacts our students and our institutions, but our institutions are always reactive versus responsive.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's like, you say you were a sanctuary city, state, campus, over the last couple of years, but you really have to lay out a plan of what does that look like? What are you willing to do to protect your students, and not wait for like an institution to tell you how to protect your students, because they're not, and they haven't, right? And that's the reality across the history of, of folk who have immigrated here, right? And that's the reality that we need to sit with, is that we can't wait for a legislature to happen to tell us like, well, how do we protect our students? I understand that there's policies in place that impact institutions, but I also understand that leaders curate policy, right? Leaders implement and employ policy. So depending on their like policy praxis and how they view the employment of that work, that's gonna manifest itself differently depending on who you are as a leader and the work you've done to understand the repercussions of the students that you're supporting, right? So I work with undocumented students, for example, in student government. And in student government, my students get a stipend to participate because they're the student voice, and they're spending 20 hours a week putting in work, right? Attending meetings on top of going to classes and everything they're doing. And I've had undocumented students who are like, I can't get that stipend. And I'm like, for me, I could easily be like, well, then you can't be part of student government because that's the policy. Right? Like, I could say that because that's in line with, but for me, that's not being equity minded and supporting my student. For me, it's like, well, if this is the policy, let's change it, right? Let's think about what is the work necessary to do, because you represent the student voice, because there are other undocumented students on your campus. So you're bringing that voice that is needed. So the way I've done certain things is working with foundation, right? Like, do we create a new scholarship? And a scholarship, doesn't require citizenship status, because often scholarships also have that like little caveat. Yeah. Do we work with alumni giving? What are creative ways to look for funding for the student who needs it probably the most, because they don't have access to other sources of funding, right? But that requires me as an institutional leader to think beyond the constructs of this policy that was created by someone, right? Like, it didn't just exist. Like, we formulated it so we could always change it as well. Some of my work dives into like critical policy analysis frameworks. And one of the things that we talk about is the policy is always inconstant, right? A policy is never fixed. Because when we create a new policy, it's probably to undo a policy that didn't work the last time. So we're always constantly like in flux of a policy change. Like, that's always a constant. But people love to be like, whoa, this is what the policy says. Yeah, but the policy can be interpreted. The policy can be changed. So I think that's always important to remember, because our practices are informed by those pieces. So we have to think about how do we tackle that in order to support our students. So when we think about sanctuary campuses, how do we tackle policies that back up that statement, right? What are clear steps, clear strategies, clear resources that are going to be allocated to support that? That's great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it really makes me think a lot about, so I mean, ideally we have policies, right? But right now I'm thinking a lot about the return to the classroom, because the fall is coming up, and a lot of my thinking about the fall has been around the upcoming election and BLM protests and the movement, obviously the pandemic, and kind of the vulnerable position in which we're returning to the fall. And your emphasis on two things has really kind of made me wonder how teachers can really support undocumented students in meaningful ways. Because first of all, I think a lot of what you've said has highlighted how we rarely ask ourselves what it means to be a citizen, or why. To your point earlier about, a lot of undocumented people contribute taxes we know they contribute incredibly to the labor force in many ways and in many areas, right? But still, they don't, for too many, they're undeserving of the status of citizenship. And then in the classroom, we often frame inclusive, or at least not inclusivity, but we often frame the idea of building a community using the term citizen, right? Saying you have to be a good citizen of the classroom. And ever since I've been actively involved in supporting undocumented students, I've taken that language out of my syllabus, partly because I think that immediately frames the classroom as, well, in the terms of in a legal framework where my undocumented students don't fit, that in a legal framework that has constantly been rejecting my undocumented students' right to be treated as citizens and to be given that status. But as you're like, what I'm hearing you say is, you know, how supportive is that really, right? If I'm not acknowledging it explicitly for my students, for my whole class, like this is why I'm not going to use this term, or kind of being much more transparent about what I understand as community and how I understand communities to be constituted. And it's also making me wonder how, especially given the incredibly vulnerable position in which our students currently are, how can I, as a teacher, actively support them, without betraying their confidence and or kind of making them feel like they have to disclose anything to me, and also kind of, because there aren't really any policies in place. I mean, PLU, I think, has been really great about affirming support, creating resources. Our D Center is central, I think, to that support. And yet, I think that I'm not really sure how much my colleagues are thinking right now about undocumented students when they're thinking about everything they have to, like who they have to protect when they're teaching, or who they have to teach for. So what would you tell a faculty member going into fall 2020 in the particular context in that we're in, and specifically given what the administration has been doing to DACA, and kind of how that psychological and emotional trauma for our students seeps into their sense of self and their state, right? What would your state of well-being, what would you tell, if you had to tell a faculty member 3 things you could do for your undocumented students, what would they be?
I think one for sure that especially in regards to mental health, right? One of my peers who's a mental health counselor and does research in mental health, they've taught me that assumed trauma has happened, right? Anybody with a minoritized identity has experienced trauma, right? Because we are explicitly being attacked through practices, policies, and historical context, right? So we can assume trauma has happened in our experience. It's not like, well, what if? No, it has, right? So that's number one, like assume trauma has happened, in this case specifically for our undocumented students, right? 2 is explicitly how you said, Profe, is how do you then position yourself as a place where you can be an access to resources, and that they explicitly know that you can be an access to resource. Understanding, right, that you won't have all answers. We know that. But what does it mean for a student to know, like, I can clearly go to this professor to be the pinpoint or the bridge to the resource that I might need, right? And that might be the language that you said, how you co-create your classroom, but also like, what are you providing your syllabus, right? Your syllabus is the life document. So what is included in there, what's not? I'm sure it's probably in there, you know, people include like different statements around academic integrity and things like that. Like, what does it mean to also include maybe, here's a folder on Drive or Canvas or whatever platform you use for like just resources broadly, right? And then you can have one like, here's a folder, here's a link to the undocumented resources that we have.
Great.
Right, like that might be a direct piece. And I think other things with the faculty is like, consider the way you can utilize your voice to work with administration, right? To create a comprehensive plan then of the policy piece then, right? Because one is like the individual, like as faculty members, you know, you all have academic freedom and like that piece of the classroom that you get to construct that space. Is that at an individual level, like up to you. I mean, I'm sure there's your department chair and your departments, but ultimately the faculty kind of get to do what they want. But then, right, then there's like you exist in a larger like ecosystem of the institution. And then that you also have different stakeholders. So how do you collaborate with these stakeholders then to advance the policies that are going to allow for the access to resources, right? The allocation to resources. I think for faculty, one of their ways is their scholarship and their research. So, you know, can you write something where like, here's the call to action for us, or can you form part of the work that's being done with administration to offer that in-classroom perspective? And I know institutions do this, right? I'm not saying that this doesn't exist already, but I think that's continuous. Like you have to, like this is for the long run work, right? It's not a overnight thing. And similar to what you shared, Profe, about like Black Lives Matter, right? We're seeing this urge, like we're going to create task forces and we're going to hire the AVP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And these are all like, again, reactionary solutions that are like short term. But I think we really have to pause and be like, what are long-term sustainable, like structural pieces that we need to tackle? Because what we're experiencing now is what we experienced in 2016. And what we experienced maybe in 2011 when like, you know, I remember PLU had their first undocumented student that like shared out, and one of the alum who's been really active, right? In like helping PLU like be understanding, like we have undocumented students. So, you know, so that issue is still continuing, but then the call to action is still like, well, we have these resources in this website, go. It's like, it's been 10 years, y'all. Like, it can't just be the website anymore, right? And this is not exclusive to PLU. You know, I'm just sharing it because that's our institutional context, but higher ed institutions as a whole, right? It can't just be like the website now, right? It's what else? What are structural pieces that have happened since then? And the faculty, I think, are like great little, ¿cómo se dice? Like time capsules, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've probably like outlasted some of the administration that's like changed. So you've kind of have the history and knowledge of where it started, how it started, that one student who came up to you, what was done, how then nothing was done, how now we're trying to do something again because of the social context. So that is so valuable. How do we bring that in and work with that to then really cultivate some long-term solutions? So, I mean, assume trauma, right? Your individual classroom and individual impact, but then like collaboration and cross like working with administration and other stakeholders to then mobilize the policies that need to take place to support students.
Fantastic.
That's perfect. Yes. And something that we've seen in the past like month, I believe, is the with COVID happening and everything, is like online classroom or remote. And one piece that was put forward from the administration is like anybody who is not in an online and not in an in-person class is going to be deported. And so, you know, institutions like PLU and other ones in higher ed need to think about like, how are we protecting our students and how do we make sure that they have an equitable experience at their college and be able to essentially have an education to be able to pursue education and fulfill that goal, if that's their, you know, the end goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about PLU and resources and things that are happening. We'll be putting forward in our, in the description of our video what we have at PLU. So financial aid that's available, funding for textbooks, course materials, lab materials, getting guidance on your WAFSA, because that happens every semester. We need to make sure people have knowledge in navigating that.
Mm-hmm.
And scholarships and fellowships, because for DACA recipients and non-DACA recipients. So be sure to check those out and yeah, use them. I hope y'all use them as both incoming students and also continuing students. And
we also kind of indicate who's an ally and who kind of has had has educated themselves in terms of what undocumented student support means by hanging a little sign on our doors that says, we work with and for undocumented students. And so you can also look for those on campus. Obviously, the fall is going to be something blended. But this conversation is also making me think about how we can message that online as well. But there are a lot of people on campus in all our offices that have that little sign by their door to indicate who you can talk to, that can either direct you to the resources you need, or who can actually already kind of directly answer a specific question. So that's also something too.
Yeah, thank you for that.
A great resource that I added in that is less so much for students, but more for like staff and faculty. It's a joint statement from ASHE, the American the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and then ACPA, which is College Educators International Association. So it's two associations in higher education. So some of my colleagues, Dr. Nienhauser, Alonso Reina, he works at Salt Lake Community College, and then Dr. Cynthia Salazar, who's an assistant professor at Texas A&M. They do a lot of work on undocumented students in critical scholarship. They are undocumented or were undocumented at some point. And their, I think, scholarship is really, really powerful. And this joint statement that they created for the association has a reference list, which has tons of resources, but they do have a clear like outlining of like who, like federal, like legislative, state, and then they also have like who are institutional agents that impact student success. And then they have like implications for practice, basically a call to action, like what are some steps that you can do. So I think that's a good one for like, you know, for you all to disperse to your teams, to like the administration, and to think about like, hey, here's this kind of blueprint to start off. How do we take it and then contextualize it to our institution here at Pacific Lutheran University? So that was what I put for you all there.
Awesome. So it's on our YouTube resources. People can find it. Thank you.
Cool. So we head into our last segment. Is palabra del día. We asked Ángel, what is one word of the day that you want to share with our audience that comes from Spanish and doesn't really translate well to English, or it's kind of, you know, it's kind of weird, but it makes more sense when you speak it in Spanish. So what was that palabra del día, Ángel?
Oh dang it, we already got to the end. That was fast, y'all.
Oh.
That was such a fast conversation. Well, before I go to the palabra del día, I just want to say like thank you, and then also again honor our students who are facing this violence on their existence, and know that we are here for you and with you in whatever we can do. And that we are the ones that are going to change this together, right? I think it's something to remember. And I think one of the things I learned from Black feminists and Chicana feminists is to think about like the concept of hope, the esperanza, right? And to have critical hope that a better tomorrow will come, because this is not new. Like our ancestors have experienced this, right? Our gente has constantly been under attack, and yet we still here we are. And we're resilient and strong, and we shouldn't have to be, but that's the beauty of where we come from. So, so I just want to offer that. And then as we think about moving forward to like a word that like, you know, it doesn't translate. One of the ones I thought about, especially for fall, is like the ponte las pilas. So growing up is something that my dad and my mom would tell me when like, you know, if I was being a huevón or kind of like being lazy, they're like, get it together. It's like ponte las pilas, meaning like get your shit together, or, you know, get your like self ready to hustle type thing, because, you know, nothing's just gonna come by you just being there, right? So as I think about transformation too, like I think it's important for me to self-care and have my times where like, oh my gosh, nothing matters, everything's a mess. But also like it's up to me to make that change, right? It's up to me to like mobilize, to do something in whatever sphere I can, and knowing that I won't be able to do, you know, everything, but where can I start? So ponte las pilas is like my word, right? Like get your, you know, it translates to like put on your batteries, which again doesn't kind of like translate, but it means kind of like, you know, get your hustle going, get going type thing.
Con ganas.
Con ganas, absolutely. Yeah, and that's That's what we need in the fall. As Ángel is saying, we'll have our moments of like, this sucks. But I really do agree with you that we need hope and we need ganas. We need to know that we have what it takes to get through this and to make the changes that need to be made. So I really appreciate you kind of framing that in those terms for all of us. I think both students and everybody else at the institution, we need to ponernos las pilas for sure.
Well, thank you, Ángel, so much for joining us today on BilingLutes, our fourth episode, I believe, already.
Our next to last. So we're really thankful you were here with us and really educating us in so many ways.
Gracias.
Absolutely. And
Well,
so,
thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Adela.
No, I was just going to say next week we'll be closing off the series or the first part of the series with a current student who's going to be with us talking about a bunch of awesome important topics from values to how to prepare for the fall. So we hope you'll join us again.
Our season finale.
Exactly. Ooh, then that raises the stakes, though. We have to do something special.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining in.
Gracias. Feliz
Ciao.
semana. Hasta pronto.